So thank you again for joining us tonight. Author Ted Stout will share images and read from his new book about craters of the moon. Ted served as a park ranger from 1988 to 2020 at 7 different national parks. He spent the last 17 years of his career as Chief of Interpretation and Education at Craters of the Moon National Monument and Preserve. His new pictorial guide, Craters of the Moon National Monument, honors the 100-year history of this remarkable place. Published in 2022, it is part of the Images of America series, which presents distinctive stories from the past that shape the character of our communities today. To illustrate the book, Ted drew from extensive park archives as well as collections at Boise State University, United States Geological Survey, and other institutions. So without further ado, please welcome Ted Stout.
All right, so if you want to pull up that first slide. I just wanted to thank our host, especially Kristen, for scheduling this talk not once, but twice. And I also wanted to offer sincere apologies to anybody who may have come out for the February showing that did not happen. You definitely didn't want to be in the same room with me. I'll just leave it at that. But I'm really happy to be back here, and thank you so much, Kristen, for arranging this. Also wanted to thank the Idaho Humanities Council. This program tonight is part of a lecture series that they have called Inquiring Idaho. And they have an amazing list of speakers, including myself, who are available to give presentations about many different aspects of this great state. So if you want to find out more about that, then check out their website. Also wanted to thank the Craters of the Moon Natural History Association. Let's give them a round of applause back here. We have Sarah Rogers, who is the Executive Director for the Craters of the Moon Natural History Association, and Rhonda Morris, who was the former Executive Director of the Craters of the Moon Natural History Association. And Rhonda was is also the chair of the board, and I am a board member for that organization, which provides support for the educational and scientific endeavors of the National Park Service at Craters of the Moon. And while we're at it, I want to point out we also have the superintendent for Craters of the Moon back here, Wade Vegas. All right, so let's see, then we just move on to the next one here. I can do that, okay. All right, so here I am back in my ranger days. And this is the book. And so this is what the presentation is about tonight. I wanted to tell you a little bit about myself. Like Kristen said, I worked for the National Park Service for about 32 years and had the great pleasure of working in 7 different units of the National Park System. I started off in the wilds of downtown Philadelphia, Independence National Historical Park. And I did not crack the bell. It was already cracked when I got there, but I must have done something wrong because my next stop was Alcatraz Island. That's, if you don't know, that's where they send the really bad rangers out there. So I did hard time on the rock and eventually escaped from Alcatraz and headed south to the Santa Monica Mountains, which is a low mountain range outside of Los Angeles going up into Ventura County. And then I went to a much, much taller mountain up in the Pacific Northwest, Mount Rainier National Park up in Washington. And decided to go to an extremely different volcanic environment. So I came out to Idaho and started at Craters of the Moon. I spent 17 years at Craters, and during that time also I did a short detail at Carlsbad Caverns National Park down in New Mexico. So, like I would always tell visitors when they ask me which one was my favorite, I tell them, just like a good politician, whichever one I'm at. And I mean that sincerely. So they're all special places. So tonight's program is entitled People of the Moon, and we're going to talk about the human history of Craters of the Moon. And we have a little bit of music to bring us back to the halcyon days of 1924. That year, President Calvin Coolidge established a new national monument in south central Idaho, describing it as a weird and scenic landscape peculiar to itself. Presidential Proclamation number 1694. And true to form, it got weird right away. In fact, we're proud to declare that we are the only officially weird unit of the National Park System. So the locals decided to gather. Nobody from the Park Service had actually come out to Craters yet. But a month later, the locals got together down at the base of Inferno Cone. They put up Old Glory. They had speeches and some music. And during one of those wonderful speeches, somebody turned around and yelled, "The volcano! It's erupting!" And sure enough, they looked up at Inferno Cone, and behind it are the spatter cones, and black smoke was issuing out of one of the spatter cones. As it turns out, some wiseacre had set some tires on fire inside one of the spatter cones. So like I said, it got weird right away. So I think Craters of the Moon is a very special place, and it's something that we should all celebrate, especially since next year it's going to be 100 years old. And one thing though, make sure to observe all park rules and regulations. No fires are allowed in the park, okay? You got that? Okay, all right, good. Of course, there were some real fireworks that occurred here long before June 1924, and those began 15,000 years ago when the ground beneath the Snake River plain ripped apart and red-hot magma made its way up to the surface. You can see in the middle here, this is a rift or a fissure eruption in Hawaii. At Craters, you can see it on many different scales. You can see it up close, like here you can see this line cutting through up to the Pioneer Mountains. You can also see it on satellite photos, like this one here. You can see this line coming down and connecting up to here. That's the volcano that created this landscape, starting 15,000 years ago and ending about 2,000 years ago. There have been 8 major eruptive events over that time, and they've occurred roughly every 2,000 years. The last event was about 2,000 years ago, so who knows? Yeah. So it starts off as that curtain of fire, and as the lava comes out, it begins to pinch itself off, and what you end up with are these individual vents, like in the center photo here. And those individual vents create fountains of cinders that create cinder cones. And towards the end of the eruptive cycle, when most of the gas has been expelled, you end up with globs of lava called spatter that create these miniature volcanoes that are called spatter cones. And Craters of the Moon has some of the best preserved examples you'll find anywhere of these particular features. We're really big on the geology field camp circuit. People come from all over the country to see our spatter cones out there. Of course, that, all that lava created habitat for a surprising diversity of plant and animal life. There are over 750 different plant types that have been found at Craters of the Moon, and about 300 different types of critters that have been found there as well. Not counting insects, we have no idea how many different insect species we have. Some of these plants are pretty special, like the one on the left of the screen there. You can see that quite prominently as you drive the loop, especially, say, in mid-June. That's called dwarf buckwheat or cushion buckwheat. That's the only place on the planet you'll see that particular subspecies. It grows nowhere else except at Craters of the Moon. A variety of critters as well, like the pika. You've probably seen lots of pika up in the mountains. People are surprised to know that we have a population that lives on the lava. And those little rock rabbits are very heat-sensitive little creatures. And the surface of that black rock can get up to 150, 170 degrees on a hot day. So the way they're able to survive is they spend most of their day down in those deep cracks in the lava where it stays nice and cool. If you want to see these creatures, you have to get up early in the morning and get out there on the trail. The lava also created some refuges for plants as well. In the center, you can see an enormous juniper tree, which is preserved in an area that's known as a kipuka. We use the Hawaiian terms for many of these different features. And kipuka is a Hawaiian term that talks about an island of older lava surrounded by younger lava. And so these islands of lava that are older are vegetated, much more vegetated than the surrounding lava, and they contain a natural assemblage of plants that have been unaffected by grazing and other activities. And they're very difficult to get to. That's Brian Bean right there, actually hugging the tree. Yeah. All right. So, of course, all of these lands were part of the ancestral homeland of the Shoshone and Bannock tribes, and they were no strangers to this landscape. Although they did not have any permanent villages in the area because there's darn little water available. But if you've ever stayed at the campground, rest assured that you were not the first to camp there. In 1995, the park conducted an archaeological survey of one of the campsites, and they found a little bit of burnt bone and rock chips and such. So the Shoshone Bannock stayed at the lava flow campground long before it was a campground. There's other evidence that they passed through the area, like these rock rings that are outside of what is known as Indian Tunnel. And a few projectile points and arrowheads and such have also been surveyed in the monument as well. I had the good fortune of meeting this gentleman, Laverne Bronco, back in 2008. He was a Shoshone Bannock elder, and he told me that this place is sacred to us, very sacred. What's unique is that this landscape is protected, and this place may be the last stronghold of our native plants. Also had the great fortune of working with these young people from the tribes who came out and participated in an education program at the park as well, and I made several trips out to Fort Hall to work with them as well, and that was a great experience. So we talked a little bit about the geology and also about the first people at Craters of the Moon. Let's move on to written history. And so we're going to talk about what happened before the monument. Most people went out of their way to avoid the lava, but eventually a few folks began to pass through, especially during the Oregon Trail period, when in the 1860s, one of the major routes was a route called Goodale's Cutoff that led people up towards the Pioneer Mountains around the edge of the lava. And there were a good many people that made that trip, and they wrote nasty stuff about Craters of the Moon in their journals. One of those was this miner, Julius Merrill, who was heading to the Salmon River mines. And he said, "It was a desolate, dismal scenery up or down the valley as far as the eye could reach. The same unvarying mass of black rock. Not a shrub, bird, or insect seemed to live near it. Great must have been the relief of the volcano, powerful the emetic, that poured forth such a mass of black vomit." So I think we missed a grand opportunity. We could have called it Black Vomit National Monument. But no, that wouldn't work. On a ranch near the northern part of Craters of the Moon, there's a small mound of rocks, and according to the former ranch owner, it's a place where a little girl who was a part of one of those wagon trains never made it to Oregon. They believe she was bit by a rattlesnake, and there she lays. In 1994, the park staged a reenactment of one of the wagon trains, and they had costumed actors come out. And they had Tim Goodale himself on the left there, and his Shoshone Bannock wife, Jenny. And that was a great experience for everybody to celebrate that part of the history of Craters of the Moon. Like I said, most people were happy to have craters in the rearview mirror, but there were a few hardy folks that stuck around. And they established mines in the Pioneer Mountains. In the 1880s, there was a lead-silver boom. And there were two boom towns that were started just up Blizzard Mountain Road there. Two towns, not just one. One of them was called Era, and the other one was called Martin. And there was a rancher up there named Era Martin. So, and on the left here, you can see what was left of the Martin mine. And that old shack there was all that was left of that operation. In the late 1960s, the Craters of the Moon Natural History Association actually purchased that property, that claim, and donated that to the National Park Service. So that land is now part of the National Monument. Era Martin himself built this watering trough, which is located out in the wilderness. And it was right next to part of the Great Rift, where there is generally some ice and water deep down below. He used to throw down his bucket, pull the water out to water his sheep when he brought them out to Craters. So eventually, just curiosity led people to seek out this blank spot in the map and come and check it out. And one of those curious scientists was this gentleman here, Harold Stearns. And he came out here in the early 1920s and was just blown away by the volcanic landscape here. He went from Idaho to Hawaii and learned a whole lot more and brought what he knew back to Idaho again. He also brought his wife, Nora, with him, and Nora was a geologist as well. We'll talk more about her in just a minute. Harold described the area. He said, the similarity of the dark craters and the cold lava to the surface of the moon, as seen through a telescope, gives to these peculiar features their name. So they made a pretty rough camp on one of their earliest visits to the area, and he and Nora hung out in that tent there. He was sent back to the area by the National Park Service because they were interested in this area. They had heard about it, and they wanted him to describe the area, delineate the boundaries, and state the reasons for its preservation as a national monument. Nora was also a fascinating character. She wrote really evocative prose about her experiences at Craters of the Moon. Things like, I always seemed to be gazing out the door or window in a troubled, puzzled way. Something was strange. Perhaps this area is indeed an unfinished corner of the universe, where the chaos of the primeval world still exists. And she ended it by saying, the mountains seem to be a symphony, the lava's a rhapsody. So you can see her in her flapper hat there, standing on the lava next to Great Owl Cavern. And then the picture of her is from her college days. Another pivotal character to Craters of the Moon is this gentleman right here, Robert W. Limbert, otherwise known as Two Gun Bob. And he explored all over Idaho, and he wrote about his experiences in local and national media. And the Idaho Statesman, he declared, right here in Idaho, a miniature replica of the moon country, a riot of color and fantastic shapes, so unearthly as to make one believe himself on another planet. He was also a photographer. He ran a taxidermy shop in downtown Boise. But his main hobby was getting out there in the field and taking photographs. And he took all kinds of amazing pictures of Craters of the Moon and also of the Sawtooth Mountains. In 1920, he launched his first major expedition into the lava, and he coaxed his friend, I don't know if they were still friends afterwards, but his buddy Walter Cole to go with him. And they also brought along his hunting dog. You can see him right here. His name was Teddy. And they hiked from south to north, all the way across the Great Rift. It took them 17 days to do that. And they regretted bringing Teddy because he tore up his paws on the lava. They had to cut some leather out of one of the guy's jackets to make little booties for him, so get him across. And Walter Cole, who's right over here, he tore up his paws pretty badly too. So they had to spend a few days in Echo Crater to recover. But the very next year, he was back out there again. This time, he was sponsored by the Idaho Statesman, and he brought together a whole crew of people and they headed out into the lava. He brought with him some scientists this time. He brought biologists from the Smithsonian and another fellow from the United States Biological Survey. And their stated purpose was to make an exhaustive study of the lava formations, birds and animal life, and explore the many craters. There's some other interesting characters in this picture I just want to point out briefly. This gentleman on top of this natural arch here, he would become governor of Idaho. He actually served 2 terms as governor. His name was Clarence Botolfson, and he was from Arco. And then down here on the bottom right is another very important character in the history of craters of the moon, and that fellow is named Sam Paisley. And we're going to be talking about him some more in just a bit. So when Lambert wasn't out tramping across the lava, he went on the lecture circuit, and he had a varied show of lantern slides. He would show his amazing photographs. He would also do bird calls, of course. And he would top off his show with some trick shooting at the end. He was an amazing marksman. In fact, he is reputed to have done this amazing trick. He would take a washer, like so, and he would flip it up into the air. He'd pull out his gun, and he'd shoot through the center hole. and then people say, well, it already has a hole. Okay. All right, so then he'd take some tape, cover up the hole, and he'd flip it up in the air again, and he'd shoot right through that hole. So that's what they said he did. He was known to exaggerate a little bit. But he was definitely on his way up. Unfortunately, he died relatively young. He was about 48 years old. But his agent in Chicago described him as an entertainer deluxe, an extraordinary naturalist, explorer, author, photographer, and cowboy humorist, second only to Will Rogers. In March of 1924, the National Geographic published an article that he had written and illustrated with his photographs entitled Among the Craters of the Moon. And this was really the first time that this unknown area came out to a national audience. Something else you might know about Two Gun Bob is he built Redfish Lake Lodge. So he bought this small building and a boating operation in about 1928 and added on to it and created Redfish Lodge. And just within the last few years, they named the bar after him. It's called Lambert's Bar now, so there we go. 1926, he led his last expedition into the lava. You can see him on the far right here. And he recruited adventurers from mountaineering clubs all over the Pacific Northwest. And there were several women who actually went along with the group as well. And they were amazingly hardy folks. They hiked all the way out to a place called the Lost Valley. And that is one of many different cinder cones that follow the Great Rift. But what they found there was archaeological evidence that the Shoshone Bannock had been way out there on the lava in the past. And they also found caves with ice floors, so they were able to get some water when they got out there as well. And they had a grand old time, and they carried a typewriter along with them and had a daily newspaper they put out called the Luna Times. And it was just filled with gags and jokes and all kinds of stuff. So thanks to people like Harold Stearns and Nora Stearns and Two-Gun Bob Limbert, this area came to public notice, and more people started to come out to visit. The picture on the left is from 1918. The picture on the right, I have no idea what the date is on that, but probably a bit later. So, as I've already mentioned, on May 2nd, 1924, Calvin Coolidge established the new national monument. Believe it or not, nobody from the National Park Service actually came out to the park until 4 months later, in September of that year. But this gentleman right here was particularly important. He was not only the superintendent for Yellowstone National Park, he was also one of the founders of the National Park Service. His name was Horace Albright. And he reported directly to Stephen Mather, who was the first director and founder of the National Park Service. And Steve Mather had sent Horace out here to check out this new place. And he met with local and state politicians at Craters. He also met with this gentleman here, who I've already introduced, and that is Sam Paisley. Sam was from ARCO. He was retired. And they made him a deal he couldn't refuse. They were going to pay him $1 a month to be custodian of Craters of the Moon National Monument. And believe it or not, he did refuse it initially. He said, "You got to be kidding me. I'm not going to do this for $1 a month." They finally talked him into taking on the role. They said, "You can continue your guide service. You can still bring in some money from that, and we'll pay you that $1 a month." And so he took the job, and they installed our official representative at the monument, Stephen Mather. Said that in 1925. Sam Paisley had spent about 14 years exploring the lava. He had gone out with Harold Stearns and with Robert Limbert on all of their expeditions, and he was the man to go to if you wanted to go out on the lava. So he was a good choice. You can see him sitting here with his trademark hat. And so he took on the role of custodian. And custodian was a good title because, yes, you cleaned the toilets too, because he was the one and only ranger at the park back in the day. And he had no operating budget, so he used his own money to build this little shack here. And that became the first headquarters for Craters of the Moon. He also built this little table out here and put some rocks on it, so that became the first visitor center. This was located next to a water hole. You can see this gentleman has a bucket in his hand, and that was the only source of water in the park back in the day. And they also cleared out an area near that water hole. They called this Cinderhurst Camp, and that was the first campground at Craters of the Moon. Well, Sam recognized that the water situation is going to be one of the most serious problems to confront us. And there were several problems with the water availability. First of all, there were just a few of these little water holes, places where ice keeps the water on the surface instead of the water filtering down into the lava rock like a sponge. There's just a very few of these water holes. And one of those was this water hole called Registration Water Hole next to that shack I was just showing you. Sanitation soon became an issue. with this shared resource, people dipping out water and also cleaning their dishes and doing their laundry. So the Park Service put up some official signs to try to prevent that. But sure enough, in 1927, that water hole went dry, and there was no water available in the park. There were some other issues back in the day. Just getting to the monument was pretty much an epic adventure back in the day. Once you got there, and you were driving on that cinder-covered loop road, it was real easy to slide off that road into the lava, just like this gentleman did here. You can see Sam Paisley supervising the extrication of that horseless carriage there. Nora Stearns had a similar experience when she was driving around the loop. She said, "When driving into the spellbound fragment of the universe, let the driver keep his eyes on the road. Too much scenery brought me woe." So in 1927, they decided, why don't we move a little closer to the highway? And so they did. And through a combination of federal funds and private enterprise, a few structures were built in that area, which now serves as the park's campground, the Lava Flow Campground. You can see two of those structures in this picture here. This is called the Crater Inn, and this became the residence for the custodian. The Crater Inn was no Awani Hotel or Old Faithful or El Tovar. It was a pretty rustic log cabin. They had a small restaurant in the main lodge there, and read descriptions where when the wind blows, it used to blow right through the logs and cinders would come flying in and get on people's food. And the chimney, made of lava rock, also leaked smoke, so it was filled with smoke and cinders. Lovely place. There was a gas station, so you could fill up your rig right here. And there were also some tent cabins out back. But Joe G. Martin of the Martin family described the amenities in the following manner. He said, "Comforts come to Craters of the Moon. Cabins and a lunch service free the visit to the lava formations from inconvenience and hardship." Thanks to the Depression, a few more dollars trickled in, and through some of these emergency programs, Craters of the Moon actually got some money for the very first time in its history to build some structures. One of those is this log comfort station, which still serves its original purpose today in the Lava Flow Campground. So that is one of two restrooms in the campground there. Another building that's still standing is this old log storage building here. And that building still has the original Federal Public Works project sign within it, identifying that particular project. And this was the lovely custodian's cabin here. That building, unfortunately, is no longer with us. It was torn down in the late 1950s, and you'll find out why in just a bit. After the, I also wanted to mention this quote by the fifth custodian. Actually, he was the first superintendent, because during his term, they changed the name of the park manager from custodian to superintendent. Guy McCartney in 1937. He wasn't real happy about the new look. He said, "Log structures are entirely inappropriate here, as there's hardly a tree in the whole area." This, of course, was how park buildings looked back in the day. They call it parkitecture. It didn't matter if there weren't any trees. This is what it was going to look like, of course. So when those Depression era monies ran out, things got pretty desperate during the war years, and park management had to do what they could to shore things up. They took one of the old tent cabins from the lodge and they turned it into the administrative building there, the ranger station. They also took what was left of Paisley's old shack and they cobbled together this tar paper shack here. This was the nicest lodging for rangers and up until the 1950s right here, so pretty rough. One thing that people looked forward to back in the day from about the 1920s up until the 1970s, they would have a huge opening day celebration once they opened up the road again after the long winter. And this was in 1939. You can see the old log buildings in the background there. There were marching bands, and there was a posse of horses that ran down one of the cinder slopes, and lots of speeches and hoopla and such. Here's a charming postcard from that era showing some of the features that you could see back in the day. Thanks to the National Park Service, you can still see all of these features today. So finally, in the late 1950s, our ship came in, and the Congress took pity on places like Craters of the Moon, and they sent some money our way. And they started a project, nationwide project called Mission 66. So I don't know if you've noticed when you've traveled around to national parks, but a lot of buildings kind of have that 1960s George Jetson kind of look. Have you noticed that? Yeah. The reason why is because of Mission 66 was it was a celebration of the 50th anniversary of the National Park Service, which was established in 1916. This was the first permanent ranger at Craters of the Moon, Robert Zink, and he got to see lots of changes occur between 1952 and 1956. He said, Mission 66 has broken over our heads almost with a vengeance. We are among the first areas to receive its many blessings. So the first thing they did was out with the old, so they carted off the Crater Inn, and the Crater Inn still exists. It's on a ranch up in the Lost River Valley. And then they started construction of the current complex that you see when you go to Craters of the Moon. And you can see in the picture here some of the new housing, employee housing here, which is still used for that. The old utility building here, which is the maintenance structure. Notice right here, there's no visitor center yet, just the parking lot and the foundation. So it had not been built when this photograph was taken. Finally, in 1958, the new visitor center was completed, and it was highlighted in National Geographic magazine, of course, in a 1960 edition. And they had these beautiful photographs of the new shiny visitor center here and the interior of the museum. Mission 66 also brought some funding to pave that road for the very first time in the park's history. And so they did some work on the shoulders here, and they also actually paved the loop and paved the parking lots and put in a sewage system and all the other amenities that we have today. In 1958, dignitaries gathered to celebrate the completion of the new complex. I'll point out some of these people. This was Everett Bright, who was the superintendent of the monument at the time. This fellow right here, Fred Seaton, was the Secretary of the Interior at the time. And this is our old friend Clarence Botolfson giving the speech, former governor of Idaho. Mission 66 also brought some funding to bring on essential staff for the first time in the park's history. They were able to bring on some maintenance employees to maintain the roads and facilities now that they had facilities, and administrative folks and seasonal park rangers. All right, so we've briefly gone through a lot of history there, so we're going to take a little bit of a breather here now and talk about things in a more topical way. I wanted to touch upon science, education, and art because all three of those have been important in the history of the monument as well. This is a photograph by Robert Limbert right here that he hand tinted, showing the spatter cones and Big Cinder Butte off in the distance there. Like I said, Limbert took all kinds of pictures and lots of pictures of wildlife as well. He had originally gone out into the lava in search of a rumored dwarf grizzly bear. So, to me, Craters of the Moon is kind of like, the ancient mariners, when they didn't know what was out there in the ocean, they would draw a sea monster. So there was stuff like that at Craters. So people were talking about these little dwarf grizzly bears out there. He never found a dwarf grizzly bear, but he claims to have run into a full-grown grizzly and took this photograph and wrote an article about that in the Idaho Statesman. And he said he captured the bear not with his rifle, but with his camera. And it scared the bejesus out of him, evidently. Yeah. He also took this photograph of a pronghorn antelope, and we have a major migration corridor for pronghorn. And Brian Bean helped to do some of that research and radio collaring some of those pronghorn. And they traveled, for eons, they've traveled through a narrow corridor paralleling Goodell's Cutoff from east to west. So as far as wildlife is concerned, there are three large animals that no longer exist on the Snake River Plain, and one of those is grizzly bears, bison, and then bighorn sheep. We don't have any of those anymore, but we do have almost everything else. And pretty much everything that you associate with the mountains of Idaho also spends some time down in the desert as well. Park Service didn't always do everything right. And on the left-hand side of the screen here, you can see a blaze going. In the 1960s, they waged war on a dwarf mistletoe, which is an epiphyte that grows on the limber pine there. And they cut down a whole bunch of trees, they cut the limbs off, and they burned them. It was controversial at the time. It was finally discontinued in the 1970s when the Park Service began to look at things in a more ecologically wise sort of way. As it turns out, the dwarf mistletoe is actually a native plant, not an invasive, and it's still there, and the trees are still growing, so probably wasn't the best move. On the more positive side, we got a lot of interest from scientists around that same time, and they were particularly interested in our kipukas that I already mentioned. These gentlemen came from the University of Idaho and recommended to the National Park Service that they add this area called Kari Kipuka to the monument. And we'll see if that happens. In 1983, another University of Idaho scientist, Brad Griffith, led a major deer study, and they radio collared quite a few deer in our herd. And what they discovered is that there was a very unique migration pattern that they had. They would come down in the early spring into the desert when there was a bit more moisture. And once things dried up, they would head back up into the Pioneer Mountains. And then they would head back again in the fall when we started to get some fall rain. One of the recommendations from Brad Griffith was to replace the manicured green lawn. It was out in front of the Mission 66 Visitor Center. The irrigation and green vegetation was luring a lot of those deer across the highway, and they were getting smashed by traffic. Today, when you go there, you'll see native plants, which saves the park lots of water that we don't have, and also keeps the deer alive as well. So that was definitely a good move. The National Park Service has invested a lot in a new program where they take a look at different vital signs, and they have inventoried and they continue to monitor how those vital signs change over time. And this new program has become a powerful tool for measuring change over time. And so it's a very good program. Some other scientists got interested in craters in the 1960s. You can see a geologist here pointing at the rock. Right next to him are some non-scientists, but they're very special people. They were astronauts. And this is Edgar Mitchell right here, and Alan Shepard right next to him. This is Alan Shepard on the moon in 1971. Alan Shepard was also the first American in space with the Mercury program before he joined Apollo. Edgar Mitchell, in 1999, he came back to the park, and in describing their experience at Craters of the Moon, he said, "The moon has this peculiar, eerie beauty like these flows here that excites your imagination." The scientists of NASA have continued to be very interested in Craters of the Moon. They've done oodles of research out there over the years. In 2015, there was a major deployment of scientists who came in from all over the planet, and they set up a mission control station in Arco, and they talked to simulated astronauts out in the field who were testing out different equipment. They used the actual delay that would occur if you were talking to an astronaut on Mars, and they were determining different approaches for actually communicating people with that long time delay in between sending the message and actually receiving the message. They also used some other tools like LiDAR in our caves. They're looking more and more at caves on Mars and on the moon as a potential shelter for astronauts when we get up there. And they also tested out a next generation Mars rover and drove it around the cave a little bit. Did all kinds of amazing research out there. Darlene Lim, who was the leader of that particular group, she said, "This incredible environment is as relevant and scientifically important as it was 50 years ago." And indeed, it was exactly 50 years since the first group of astronauts had come to Craters of the Moon, and since Apollo 11, the first astronauts on the lunar surface. This gentleman, Mel Kuntz, is really responsible for our modern understanding of the geology of craters of the moon. He did a great deal of research in the 1980s. He dated the flows, and he stated that the volcanic history of this place suggests another eruption in the near future. So get ready for that. And if it does happen, we hope that our seismometer, which is located on the north side of craters of the moon, will pick up those seismic signatures and will have some advance warning. Education has always been an important part of the puzzle at Craters of the Moon. Even Calvin Coolidge back in 1924 described it as having great educational value. And in 1959, they hired the first educator at the park. This is an early slide program about 1965. We get thousands and thousands of school kids that come out every year on field trips. And we also lead snowshoe walks in the wintertime, which are tremendously fun for both the kids and the rangers. For 25 years, we worked with the Idaho Falls Astronomical Society, and they would have twice a summer, they would have star parties out at Craters of the Moon. They'd set up all these amazing telescopes. We have astro rangers today that do some of the same activities at the park, so you can see our amazing night skies that we have out there. This was our first artist in residence, a woman named Cindy Tower, who came to the park and did some amazing landscape pictures in 2010. You can see she had a pretty amazing studio there. Cindy had worked with the Sun Valley Museum of Art, and in 2016, they helped us celebrate the 100th anniversary of the National Park Service by hosting a major exhibition that occurred both in the monument and also at their museum in Ketchum. This sculpture, you can still see it along the hike and bike trail over near River Run. This was created by artist John Grotti, and it has the form of one of our lava tubes at Craters of the Moon. All right, so back into history here. We're gonna end up, this is the last chapter. We're going to talk about some of the changes that have occurred to the monument itself over the last 100 years. So the monument started in 1924. Today, there's a much larger area that's managed by the National Park Service and the Bureau of Land Management, which is a monument and preserve. And we're going to talk about what that means. So when Calvin Coolidge established the monument in 1924, he recognized almost immediately that it just wasn't going to work out without a water supply. So 4 years later, he used his presidential power to expand the monument. And you can see this was the original chunk right here. He added all of this, including a little section up here on the north side of the highway. And he said that the purpose was to include certain springs for a water supply. Unfortunately, the surveying was not well done, and it would take several more presidential acts, and Congress got into the act before they actually were able to get some water. President Kennedy also used the Antiquities Act to expand the monument in 1962, and he added one of these kipukas. This is called Kari Kipuka, and he did so to preserve this island of vegetation that he said was scientifically valuable for ecological studies because it contains a mature native sagebrush grassland association which has been undisturbed by man or domestic livestock. President Nixon signed the congressional act that established the very first wilderness area in any national park at Craters of the Moon in 1970. And you can see that this wilderness area was totally within the existing monument, so no additional land was added. The Wilderness Act was passed in 1964 by Congress, and they described wilderness as an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, or man himself is a visitor who does not remain. And that certainly is an accurate description of this vast area that was included within the Craters of the Moon wilderness. In 2000, Bill Clinton wanted to leave a legacy, and he greatly expanded Craters of the Moon. So you can see the original monument. That's this little gray box right here, about 54,000 acres. All of this was, almost all of it, was federal land, and they expanded the boundary to include all of the young lavas associated with the Great Rift. A 13-fold increase in size, so it went from 54,000 acres to about 753,000 acres, which is roughly about the same size as the Sawtooth National Recreation Area. Bill Clinton sent his Secretary of the Interior to Idaho to meet with Jim Morris, who was the superintendent at the time. And Bruce Babbitt also got a tour from Mel Kuntz, the geologist. And he also met with some very worried ranchers who were concerned that they would no longer be able to graze livestock within that area. Babbitt assured those folks that they would be able to continue to graze on areas that were managed by the Bureau of Land Management. And that is the case even today. So today we have 3 separate units that make up Craters of the Moon. So in the middle is the one that you've probably been to. That is Craters of the Moon National Monument. And that's where the trails are, that's where the loop road is, that's where the campground and the visitor center are located, all of the visitor facilities. On either side of that, if you're driving along the highway, there's long stretches of lava. That area was redesignated in 2001 as a national preserve, and that area is also managed by the National Park Service. The areas outside of that, within that red border that I showed you previously, are still managed by the Bureau of Land Management, and grazing and hunting are still allowed in those areas. There's some amazing things out in the preserve. For example, Crystal Ice Cave. Has anybody ever been to Crystal Ice Cave? I know Brian has. Tom, yeah? You went to it? Yeah? Back in the day when it was open? Okay. All right, so you can still see this today. Those are people standing on the edge of the Great Rift. This is an area called King's Bowl. It's a place where when the lava came up, it came in contact with groundwater, and there was an explosive eruption that created this enormous chasm. And deep down inside of the rift, there is a cave called Crystal Ice Cave. And it was called Crystal Ice Cave because there were enormous formations of ice, these enormous ice columns inside there. And starting in the 1960s, Jim and Peggy Papadakis, this is Peggy right here, they started a show cave there, and you would pay the proprietor here at this trailer, and then you would climb down a very deep tunnel to Crystal Ice Cave. They blasted that tunnel down so that paying customers could get down there more easily. Unfortunately, also changed the air circulation, and the ice started to melt very rapidly. So that, combined with the difficulty of running a business out in the middle of nowhere, led them to close up shop. So if you go out there today, it's it's on the preserve. You can see King's Bowl, but there's no other sign of the cave, except for some interpretive signs there, actually. Most of the rest of the preserve is actually what we call wilderness study areas. So this is the wilderness area that was established in 1970, the dark gray here. These are areas that have been deemed eligible for wilderness designation, but they have not been designated. So they await an act of Congress to make that happen. In 2014, to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Wilderness Act, me and the superintendent at the time, Dan Buckley, and this guy right over here, Brian Bean, and Craig Wolfram. Does anybody know Craig? Yeah. He was our photographer on the trip, so he took these amazing pictures. Mike Mancuso, who's an amazing botanist, went with us as well. And then Ali Konkowski, who was an intern at the park that summer. We hiked all the way across the Great Rift, just like Two Gun Bob had back in the day. It only took us a week to do it, but we had all kinds of adventures. I got everybody lost at one point. Grand old time out there. In 2017, the park was designated an International Dark Sky Park by the International Dark Sky Association. And we announced that designation at a total solar eclipse that passed through the area. And it's still an amazing place to see night skies. Also the Dark Sky Reserve, which is just to the north, right, Carol? Okay. In 1974, Goodell's Cutoff was added to the National Register of Historic Places. Just this past year, in 2022, the Mission 66 Historic District was added to the National Register. So the history of the monument is gaining more notoriety. Next year will be the centennial for Craters of the Moon. So look for special events to be occurring in 2024 to properly celebrate 100 years at this national park. And what does the future hold? Well, judging by this picture, maybe the next eruption. But failing that, people have talked about renaming the national monument as a national park for at least 100 years. If that was to happen, it would not change any of the management of Craters of the Moon, besides having to change some signs. But it would lead many more people to seek out this weird and scenic landscape. And that change only awaits action by Congress to recognize the increasingly significant natural and cultural resources of this peculiar place. Thank you very much. All right. Ooh, that was long. Okay. Does anybody have any questions? Yeah.
I'm curious about the impact of
Tom,
climate change.
Tom?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm curious about the impact of climate change
Yeah.
and particularly the limber pine impact. Can you do some of that?
Yeah. If you've been out to the monument lately, the limber pines aren't looking that great. There's a lot of brown foliage, and I think it's because we have had so many dry years recently, and which is probably ultimately due to climate change. The one critter that they've looked at intensely with regards to climate change are the pika, which I said before are very heat sensitive. And we already know that there are areas south on the flow where we no longer find pika. They're really restricted to kind of the northern edge of the lava. So whether or not they're going to persist at craters of the moon is kind of an open question. Some scientists believe that craters might actually be their last stronghold because of the fact that they can still, no matter what, no matter how hot it gets on the surface, they can still climb down into those deep cracks, and because of the insulating qualities of the lava, it's relatively cool down there, and so perhaps they will persist at the monument. But those are the two main things I can think of right now. Yeah.
Any studies or theories of why the lava came up where it did? Any studies or theories on why the lava erupted exactly where it did?
Yeah, so basically you're asking, why is the Great Rift where it is? There are theories. Nobody knows exactly why, but we're firmly in the middle of the North American plate here, so it's not like it's on the edge of a tectonic plate where these things usually happen, but there are a lot of extensional forces just trying to rip the plate apart right here. So ultimately, that's the reason why the rift began to begin with. It may have something to do with the way the mountains are lined up, because the rift seems to follow some of those basin and range mountains that go off to the east and sort of line up with some of those fault scarps that created the basin and range. So it may have something to do with that, but nobody knows for sure.
Have you ever, when you talk about the Great Rift to hike it, are you talking about going down into Laidlaw, that those blows that go all the way stretch into Laidlaw? Is that a part of what you said you hiked?
Yeah, so
Are there trails in there? Because I've hiked a lot of that, but
Yeah.
I always avoided that rough country.
So there's one trail that leads, it's called the Wilderness Trail, that leads from the parking lot there at the Broken Top area, the tree molds area. And that trail goes about 4 miles, and then there's no more trail after that. So the only thing you can really follow is the rift itself. And the rift, like I showed on that photograph, is kind of a linear feature. You can see, in certain areas, you can see these deep cracks. You can also see where there are these valleys. And that's the way to hike through there. Otherwise, it's just chaos completely. So you follow that. Laidlaw Park is actually a little farther to the west of the rift itself. So the rift is right in the middle of the lava there, if that makes any sense. Yeah. Mary?
I've read that it's within the oral traditions of Native people that they did witness lava flows. Do you know anything about that?
Yes. So they have a story about a great serpent who was wrapped around a large mountain that used to exist on the Snake River Plain. Its slumber was interrupted by a lightning storm. It got angry and squeezed the mountain so hard that it split open. And lava came out and engulfed the animal. And they say that you can still see the scales of that great beast all around in the lava. So that we think that is probably an eyewitness account of past eruptions that was passed down through the generations. And there's several other stories as well. One of the best known actually is that in time of war, the Shoshone Bannock would head out into the lava and to escape from their enemies, whether that was the cavalry or another tribe. And they had certain places out there that they would go to where they knew there were water holes. And it was a great place to kind of melt into the lava and disappear.
Early on, we saw a rock ring, and I'm wondering if you know anything about that as far as from the indigenous, I assume,
Yes.
point of view.
So there are 3 of those rock rings right outside of Indian Tunnel, which is why it's called Indian Tunnel. They were there before the monument was established, but nobody has any idea how long before 1924. I've talked to Shoshone Bannock people, and they're either not saying or they don't know themselves exactly why those rock rings are there. They used to call them teepee rings, and perhaps that's what they were used for, just as a foundation for a wickiup or some kind of teepee structure. Or they may have had a completely different use. Nobody really knows for sure. There's a variety of rock structures in various odd places way out there on the lava that I've encountered. And a lot of them were just built as hunting blinds and a place to get out of the wind and such. Okay.
Any other questions for Ted? Oh, good.
So you talked about the future and of maintaining the park, but also becoming a park. Like, is this wild and unique place threatened by becoming a park and therefore attracting hordes more visitors? I know when it was the eclipse,
Yeah.
you told me about, how just the, so many people at once just really, really, stressed the area out.
Yeah.
And I'm concerned about that.
Yep, that is a good point. And certainly if we were to get that title of national park, then many more people would come out. And back during the eclipse, that was quite an amazing experience. We were just overrun at Craters. We spent several weeks just directing traffic and all of that. Hopefully it wouldn't be that bad, but that's certainly something to think about if that was to occur. Yeah. Well, well, see, that's the thing about Craters. There's only so much room. Yeah. There's. I mean, there's plenty of lava out there, but that's our resource, and you can't pave that over, you know, so, yeah.
If the designation were to change to a national park, would they institute a lottery system to control the numbers of people and the impact it would have on the environment?
There's nobody knows. I mean, chances are it's not going to happen because we've been talking about it for 100 years and it hasn't happened yet. But who knows? Yeah, that's one of those unknown things.
I know it gets hot, but how cold? Have you ever?
Yeah, it gets pretty cold. Not Stanley cold. But I've seen, you know, minus 20 or so with the wind blowing. Not really, no. In a winter like the last one we had, you can't even see any rock, you know. It's all covered up with snow. And people are always out looking for the caves. They're all filled up with snow in winters like this as well. Yeah. All right, well, thank you. Oh,
The roads that are out there, were those originally from the 1920s?
oh, the loop road?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just all the roads. So that was the original layout?
As far as I can figure, the loop road was pretty much user-generated, meaning that visitors just kind of pushed their way through until they had a path. And then the Park Service did a little work to kind of tidy that up a little bit. But there was no planning involved initially for the loop. It just happened. And then eventually, there were really no big plans until the Mission 66 program came along. And then they finally mapped everything out and you know, did a master plan for the park.
That's probably a good place
Yeah.
to leave this talk. Ted, I want to thank you so
Yeah.
much. This was a wonderful talk, wasn't it? Yeah.
Oh, most importantly, I forgot to mention, we do have books on sale back here. If you would like to support the Creators of the Moon Natural History Association, this is a great opportunity to do that, and I will be more than happy to autograph any of those books. By the way, if you have a little extra cash laying around, the Creators of the Moon Natural History Association will also be listed in Idaho Gives next month. So that's a worthy charity to donate to as well. So thank you very much. Yeah.
Thanks, everybody. And if you can fill out that survey, that would be helpful for us, too. Good night. Thanks for coming.